Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for coming, all of you. And welcome to the third lecture in this public lecture series from the archives at NCBS. For those of you who still don't know, yes, we are going to be setting up an archive later this year. I'm going to keep it at later this year because I don't want to set a date to this. The first talk was on looking sort of at environmental histories of the city. The second was institutional histories, and today I'm very pleased to have Indira here to give a sense of the oral histories, the sphere, and she's going to be sort of giving a broad expanse of the field. I'm especially pleased and privileged to introduce her as someone who actually introduced me to this campus, so thank you, Indira, on a personal note. Indira Chowdhury, no stranger to this campus, of course, is the founder-director of the Center for Public History at Srishti, formerly Professor of English at Jadavpur. She's also the founder of Archival Resources for Contemporary History. She has a PhD in history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, and her book, The Frail Hero and the Virile History, won the Tagore Prize in 2001. In 2010, she published A Masterful Spirit, Homi Bhabha, 1909 to 1966, and she was awarded the New India Fellowship to work on the manuscript of her recently published book titled Growing the Tree of Science, Homi Bhabha and the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. There's a copy of it right here. There's a copy in the library as well. Indira has been keenly interested in setting up archival resources for research, particularly oral history archives. She began the Urban History Documentation Project at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, in 1993. She set up the archives of TIFR, Mumbai, between 2002 and 2006, and curated several archival exhibitions at TIFR, including Partners in Science, JRD Tata, and TIFR in 2005, and Homi Bhabha, The Cambridge Connection, in 2007. She's created several archival books through ARC, Citizens and Revolutionaries, Looking Back, Looking Forward, and The Lives of Objects, Stories from the Indian Museum, which is the most recent publication. Cities and Revolutionaries, an oral history of IIM Calcutta, has recently won the Bronze Design Award in Italy. Indira is also a founding member of the Oral History Association of India. She was president of the Oral History Association of India between 2013 and 2016, and the president of the International Oral History Association between 2014 and 2016. I'm particularly thrilled by her topic. It's something that we've been discussing back and forth, titled Forgetting and Remembering, Oral History, Cultural Memory, and the Post-Colonial Archive. Please do give a warm welcome.
Thank you, Venkat, for your introduction. As you said, it's always a pleasure to come back to NCBS because whenever I look around, I see friends, familiar faces, people who welcomed me here when I came as a historian in residence, if memory serves, in 2002. And I spent a year here before I went off to, or 2 years here before I went off to TIFR to set up the TIFR archives. So my journey in oral history actually began right here, interviewing Obaid Siddiqui and spending very, very long hours having lunch with him, and then deciding, okay, today I shall talk to him about this period in his life, and of course reading quite a lot of science and discussing science. So it's always a pleasure to be back. But my journey since then has taken me to all kinds of places in India, and you see some of those instances here. Some of them I'll talk about, some of them I will not. So very briefly, this is Imarti Bai, who I met in northern Madhya Pradesh. She makes a living collecting medicinal plants from forests, but clashes with the forest rights, with the act that doesn't let her take non-timber forest produce out. So very interesting oral histories there. And the other one that I'll not talk about is this. You can only guess which one I am, the masked oral historian, because this was taken inside the facility of Thermopen Paul, which manufactures the first, it was the first Indian blood bag manufacturer in Thiruvananthapuram. So oral history has taken me to all kinds of places, from the subalterns to the elite in Delhi, and I'll talk about my observations about what a post-colonial archive might have and what we must do to see that it works. So I think I shall begin with our moment of independence and partition. The independence of India came with partition, and what archival evidence did we have when we look at India after 17th August 1947? Mainly there were the transfer of power papers, where people looked at, how did these governments negotiate with the British and set themselves up. But what the partition meant to people who experienced it was left out. So where was the archive that could help us understand the effect of this historic decision that had resulted in the death of 1 to 2 million people, rape of 75,000 women, and displacement and forced migration of 15 million people? It was seen, as Urvashi Butalia has said, a real upheaval in human history. So it was not until Urvashi Butalia, who wrote The Other Side of Silence in 1998, and Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin, who wrote Borders and Boundaries, looking at partition memories, you wondered where that archive was. And as they pointed out correctly, that archive was really in people's memories. But it was sealed away, and it was never recalled. It was very difficult to talk about. And it was around 1998, when they started doing this work, from the early 90s, that the publications came out in 1998, that the silence was broken. And we realized that the partition was not forgotten. It was just too painful to remember. Displacement had a peculiar effect of compelling families to hold together the larger extended family that had dispersed and remember it in an idealized form, and remember also the places that this larger family was associated with. And stories about that dispersed family then lived on in the imagination, making whole what could never be put together again. So when I started getting interested in the history of my own family, it struck me that I had not bothered with the fact that once this Radcliffe line was drawn, and you had East Pakistan and West Pakistan on one side, on both sides of India, my great-grandfather had refused to come away from East Pakistan. And it is only very recently, to my own embarrassment, that I started looking at old letters and papers and interviewing people in the family to find out more. So obviously this is a photograph of the family house in Kumla, which is now in Bangladesh. And this is my great-grandfather and his son and his wife here. This is the larger extended family. But what is interesting is that none of them really thought that the partition was going to affect them too much. They felt they could always go. It was just 24 hours away. And they described that journey, and they said, we weren't into speed. We'd just go there, see him, and come back, because he didn't want to move. And the only person, well, there are 2 of them still living, 3 of them, this kid as well, but this is my father's aunt, his youngest daughter, who's still living. So this is my oral history interview with her, where she speaks about her parents. And this is how she begins, because when we do oral history, we do go into, when were you born, when is your birthday, and we go into the story of that person's life. And you notice how the past is always present in the way she talks about her present. She never allows herself to forget that her birthday is no longer now her birthday. And of course, you realize that the partition had tremors that had very long-lasting effects, that when, after the partition, we've had several wars with Pakistan, and in 1965, when there was the Indo-Pak War, she realized that in '66, when her father died, none of them could go. None of them could really go to be with him, even though they had planned to be with him. So, this was something that shook them up. And I don't think any of us grew up with a sense of the kind of pain that they lived with, because, we identified completely as children who were brought up in India, in a democracy, with a certain pride, and we never really paid too much attention to this. And she went on to tell me that soon after that, my great-grandmother, who I had seen, actually could not manage there, and she had a very, very hard time, and actually practically lost her mind once she came here, because she was no longer in her own place. So when we look at these oral histories, we see how family memory functions to anchor the imagined undivided family, which has been fragmented by a historical event, within a landscape that no longer exists. So that's why I thought that, maybe we should, in the post-colonial archive, give thought to what is forgotten, what is remembered, what is it that we remember, what is it that we are collecting when we say we are collecting memory. To take us back into an earlier period when we were colonized, Eric Wolf's book, Europe and the People Without History, had resonances. Of course, he spoke mainly about Africa, but it had resonances for any colonized country. Because if we look at this 1982 book, where he was talking about most of the colonized countries, if we look at it without pathos of, what does it mean to be a people who have no history, I want to suggest that we should look at what was responsible for this kind of thinking, that there might be some people who have no history. Is that even possible? So what kind of archives created that kind of thinking? And what did it leave out? What did it include? Is there a fundamental flaw in the construction of the colonial archive? And why is it therefore so difficult to create a post-colonial archive that will question what was collected during the colonial period? As some of us here might be familiar with Edward Said, who wrote, again in the 1980s, this book called Orientalism, which was really looking at how the West constructed the Orient. Of course, he was again looking at the Middle East, but the way in which colonial power functioned, it functioned in the same way. And that's why, again, it became possible to see that what Eric Wolf was saying earlier was possibly, there was some truth in it, that the British constructed the colonies as places where there were either the lazy natives or people without history. This is a map of India from 1909. All the borders that are red are British India, and you'll see anything that is in pink is British India. The yellow bits, Mysore, Hyderabad, Central India Agency, Rajputana, these are yellow, so these are the independent kingdoms. I chose this deliberately because I started with the partition. This is 1909, so there has been one partition already. So you'll see Eastern Bengal here and Bengal here. So this was the first partition, which was carried out in 1905 and revoked in 1911 when Delhi became the capital. Now, the kind of thinking I spoke about earlier was very much, it can be summed up in the way James Mill talks about rude nations who derive a peculiar gratification from pretensions to a remote antiquity. It is a suspicious circumstance in the pretended records of a nation when we find positive statements for a regular and immense series of years in the remote abyss of time, but they're entirely deserted by them when we descend to the ages more nearly approaching our own. Where annals are real, they become circumstantial in proportion as they are recent. Where fable stands in place of fact, the times over which memory has any influence are rejected, and the imagination riots in those in which it is unrestrained. Now, when you look at this and you think that James Mill's History of British India is what all ICS officers had to read before they came to India to govern India, you can imagine why there'd only be a certain way of collecting things about India's past. When Bernard Cohn looked at colonialism and the forms of knowledge, what the British in India did, he began to see that Europeans tried to unlock the secret of the Indian past, and they started collecting more and more material and began to classify them according to how they understood that material. And this was the way in which they built the Indian past. Let me look at some projects of colonial India, which will give you an idea of what was being collected. This is Colin Mackenzie, who commissioned the drawings of the sculptures of Amravati. So it's true, he's not building an archive, he's rather putting things in a museum, but it's documents. The documents often go into the archive. So what was interesting is that Colin Mackenzie and most of the British officers who went around working and collecting material would have people, Indians, who helped them. So this is one, his three Indian, assistants. He's from Hyderabad, from Telangana. He's from Karnataka, and he is, I think, a Muslim gentleman who's also from the south, and he's carrying a telescope. You notice that he's carrying a telescope. He's carrying a Jain manuscript. This this painting is actually documented, and what you see in the background is Shravana Belagula, and you see that little telegraph pole-like thing. That is the first trigonometric survey of India. So there are all these symbols that are built into the photograph, into the image itself, to tell you, what is it that the British are doing in India. And while doing the archives and doing an archival book for the Indian Museum, which is Asia's oldest museum, India's oldest, of course, which started in 1814 in Calcutta, this is what I found. That this is one of the Amravati coping stones that was found in Amravati, which is there in the Indian Museum. But the drawings that Colin Mackenzie actually commissioned, those I had to look for in the Amravati albums, which are archived in the British Museum, in the British Library. So, one could bring them together only by looking at very different archives, very different museums. So this was one way in which things about India find themselves in either the British Museum or in the India Office Library and Records. Now, the Indian Museum is also one of the places where the archives enable certain kinds of very nationalist movements to take place. So this is Ernest B Havel, who was in late 19th century, he was the principal of the Government College of Art in Calcutta. And this is a student, Abanindranath Tagore, who was at that point a young teacher in the art college. And it was Havel who told him that, though your syllabus in art college is about learning the techniques of European realism, of painting like Renaissance artists, actually in your country there were other ways of painting. And this is what he showed Abanindranath. He said, look at the paintings of this Mughal painter Mansoor. Look at the way he details, this is the Bengal Florican. He details it, and the flowers he draws around it, that is the bird's natural habitat. That's how Mughals painted animals, the flora and fauna was represented around it. And Abanindranath said, well, if this is the style that my country has, what am I doing trying to paint like Europeans? So let me try to paint something very different. And this is what he produced after some years. It's called the Abhisharika, and this is what begins the Bengal School of Art. This is how you find that, this birth of the Bengal school, which lasts from the late 19th century to early 20th century, and then starts declining. But you find a very stylized kind of painting coming out of Bengal at that point. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that within the archive too, there are the ingredients of reading things against the grain and going in a completely different direction, like Abanindranath did. What the school didn't quite incorporate was folk art. And here's another question I want to raise here. That this Yashoda and Krishna is from the collection of the Indian Museum. It was collected in the 19th century. But it is only in the 20th century that you see Jamini Roy wanting to discard the Bengal school and paint in this style, saying, I want to paint in a folk form. I want to paint how the folk artist paints. And this actually brought to mind the question that if you look at the British collection of folk art in museums, that itself remains at odds with the fact that folk art existed then as living tradition outside of the museum, and even today it exists. So what I have here is something, again, these are folk artists who came and performed here, if I remember. And can you guess what this painting is about? Can anyone guess what this painting is about? Pardon? Yes, it is the 9/11, I think. You're right, and you see the faces of the demons on the two aeroplanes, you see the buildings, and where the people have no eyes or the eyes are closed, they are dead. This is Osama bin Laden, this is Bush, Condoleezza, and this is the war in Afghanistan. So the question, I had is that what are these folk artists? Do they not deserve a place in the archive, or do we not need to consult their archives? Are they informants? Are they interpreters, or are they custodians of the past in some way? Because this is very contemporary. Usually these painter storytellers, who are, this particular group is from Bengal, they create scrolls that depict mythological stories and heroic legends. And for a long time, this was the entertainment in the villages. But as they began to see that, the villagers began to be more interested in the bioscope, in the cinema, and later in television, they began to lose their clientele. But with 9/11 and later with the tsunami of 2004, they began to see that the stories in television can possibly be painted about and interpreted and sung about. And that's what they began to do. They started making series of disaster scrolls that were about disasters that had struck the world, which they hadn't experienced, but they felt that they could relate to it at a human level. So if we look at the archives of this community, it would be really interesting, because this community is Islamic by faith, though it sings of Hindu gods and goddesses. And they say that they don't see a problem with that. They say, this is just what we do, and I don't see, and we've always done it. And this is often forgotten when archives collect these scrolls without recording their songs and without undertaking oral history interviews with them. We don't quite know the context of this art. So I think the post-colonial archives needs to do a lot of this kind of oral history work. There are after effects of the colonial regime, of course, because the policies shaped our attitude to local knowledge. This is a visit I made in 2009, I think, to Hardolpur, which is again on the northernmost tip of Madhya Pradesh. And this is a community of saperas or snake charmers who told me that, well, you needn't say we are saperas. We don't really do anything with snakes. We are not allowed to. We'll get into trouble. So why don't you call us Sahariyas? I said, how can you suddenly become another community? He said, doesn't matter, you just say we are not saperas. But I kept wondering, why is it that he's doing this? Why does he think that he must call himself by another community, by the name of another community? And then, on delving, I realized that when Madhya Pradesh got divided into Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, the Sapera community became a scheduled tribe in Chhattisgarh, but not in Madhya Pradesh. In Madhya Pradesh, the Sahariyas were included. And so these communities then they wanted to change their identity in order to fit into the schemes of the state. So the state then creates these categories. And then, obviously the others want. So, you can see results of that everywhere. But this struck me as one of the most, very honest, very clear that, this is what you should, when you write about us, please say we are Sahariyas, because, we really can't do anything. We don't have much to do with snakes because of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. And kept saying that we don't know anything. And I think it's only when they begin to trust you in an oral history interview. This is what happened. I think I was standing just where you see the snake. So I'm standing here, and there's a snake, and he starts playing, and they take off the lid. And later, when I'm leaving, they say, actually, we can't live without snakes. They've always been with us. And it is really such a pity, because right behind where they live, and this whole community now just does some, they break stones and work as masons. So there is the Kuno Wildlife Sanctuary, which is the reintroduction site for the endangered Asiatic lion, and, which went into extinction in 1873, reintroduced in 2007. But there's no attention paid to local knowledge, that you could at least give them jobs as people who come and talk about snakes, who talk about the scorpions, talk about poisons, but there's nothing, no attention. So that entire attention to local knowledge is somehow just not there. So it becomes, reservation, and claiming another identity becomes their only recourse, especially when their knowledge is not even acknowledged and their practices are banned. So when I began to, look at science, when I looked back at what I was doing when I was in NCBS and TIFR, one thing that had struck me, about, when I was talking to Obed, he'd always say, why exactly do you want to talk to us? We haven't done that much work. It was C.V. Raman who discovered something. It was, not us. It was J.N. Ramachandran. And I keep wondering, I said, but you built an institution. Why is that not important? And then it is only after all these travels I realized that the educated elite of a post-colonial country is not necessarily more confident about their place in history. And I think when I revisited those conversations with Obed Siddiqui, I found that if you look at the popular history of science as it's done in India, it is a very heroic story. It is about discovery. And, Indian scientists, only a handful of them, belong then to that kind of an archive, to a very heroic archive. So, not looking at history of science as history of doing science in completely different circumstances. So, what did it take for them to set up an institute? What did it take for people to start imagining something quite different from India? And how was politics enmeshed in the lives of scientific institutions? So I felt that when I was talking to Ved Siddiqui here, and this is in his office, which will, Venkat, soon become the archives, maybe. So I think this is the office for, it's not there now, right? Okay, so this is, Siddiqui in his office, and he's talking here, about the war and the circumstances under which he could do science then.
When the war broke out, there was a severe, drastic budgetary cut, and all foreign exchange, issuing of foreign exchange was involved. So Bhabha came one day, and he had the faculty meeting, the same, this small group of 5 or 6 people, and a few more he called on that day. All group heads were there, and he said that, look, very difficult times, all the money has been, grants have been cut, plus there will be no foreign exchange available. So now I have been told that whatever is absolutely minimum essential for national interest, in the national interest, considering that war is going on, for that, we will make some money, finance ministry will make some money available. So he said.
So I'll just sum up what he says later, is that Bhabha finally looks at him and says, I know you cannot argue that what you're doing is essential to the country. He was working on aspergillus at that point. So he said, but never mind, how much do you need? We'll still try to give you something. So, he starts laughing and says, that what I was doing was not important for the country, but he let me, he didn't stop my work. So this was, the story of how, under certain circumstances, science could be done. So when we look at the history of science, if we shift away from trying to look for discoveries, you can have a lot more in the archives, not just, history of experiments and instruments. You can do a history of building the institution, what kind of practices are adopted, because this belongs to a certain post-colonial moment in India. And if you look at TIFR, this building comes up only in 62. It is, another day maybe I can talk about the modern building, the kind of architecture it uses. But we have to get away from a history of science that focuses only on discovery. So Bhabha's ambition of creating this world-class institution, of letting science grow roots in India, was, I'd say, partially successful, because it left a number of questions. Not because the science was not successful, that's not what I'm saying, but what he wanted to achieve was only partly realized, because it raised certain questions. And in the archives in TIFR, I was haunted by this image, which I found almost by accident when I was setting up TIFR archives. As all of you know, Bhabha died in an air crash in 1966, 24th January. And when I asked people, what did you do? How did you feel? They all said, well, we were devastated. It was just so sudden, so unexpected. He was all of 54, I think, but younger than I am. But what I found interesting is they all remembered only the condolence meeting that was held. They said, oh, we had a condolence meeting and we went back to work. That's what he would have liked. It is only when I started setting up the archives that I came across this. And interestingly, those of you who have seen TIFR will realize that this is in the, below the library stairs, in the front foyer, where today stands head of Homi Bhabha. Now, so then I went back to some of the scientists and I said, what's this? what happened here? So they said, oh, this is a Parsi ceremony that was held. I said, in the institute? They said, yes. And they were really very uncomfortable because suddenly science and religion were getting meshed together. And then they said, actually we did it because that's what his mother wanted. And I realized that again there was something else here, that when he sets up TIFR, it's a small institution. They are people, they know each other, his mother is often there, meets the scientists, meets the staff have memories of her, going to console her when he's dead, and they can't refuse her. So institutions have all these other mechanisms as well. And I realized that this is forgotten because within the way you do scientific work, you want to remember the secular ceremony. You don't want to remember this. It is the photograph that helps us remember this and revisit it again. There were also other kinds of forgetting that went on, as I discovered in my archival journey. This was a very famous picture and it looked so iconic. You had J.R.D. Tata, Homi Bhabha and Nehru. This is at the inauguration of the new building, till I discovered the original photograph, which also has this man here, who is K. Chandrasekharan, who set up the mathematics department. And he was missing from the official exhibition that was up in TIFR. He's back now in the present exhibition. Now this, I think, had a longer history about the group, the mathematics group, and the rivalries with the physics group. Again, things I've dealt with in my book, so I will not go into it. But I'll show you another instance of institutional forgetting. Again, this is Bhabha looking at the Srinivasa Ramanujan notebooks with Nehru. Same day. The actual photograph is again with KC. So in both these, KC was not there. And KC was not there. KC had by then left, and I think there is, in that first exhibition, there's an attempt to show Bhabha and physics in a certain light, not mathematics. But KC was very, very important to the life of the institution. And there was yet another forgetting, because when I looked at their 25-year report, it said that mathematics begins in TIFR in 1949. And I said, 1949, the institute begins in 45. The first two appointees are mathematicians. One is Professor Levy, who comes from Calcutta, German, and the other is Professor Kosambi. And Kosambi leaves the institute in 65. And this is quite a deliberate forgetting, because though Kosambi is a polymath, Kosambi at that point had claimed to have solved the Riemann hypothesis. And that was what really upset the mathematics group, who felt they were being laughed at by the world, by the international community. And Kosambi provides the paper, it's looked at, and it is not really any solution to the Riemann hypothesis, and it had come out in the Journal of Agricultural Statistics. So it was one of those things, quirky things that Kosambi fans say, but it is not something that a group that had tried so hard to establish its reputation can stand. So I think the 25-year report forgetting was fairly deliberate. I thought, since yesterday was the day George Sudarshan passed away, I thought I'll remember him here. And I'll remember him also for another reason, because Venkat, the day I interviewed him, was the first day I ever met you. We had talked before on the phone, but I remember getting out of the interview and meeting Venkat in Chennai. So this is George Sudarshan at an exhibition we had curated for IMSC, Indian, the Institute of Mathematical Sciences. But this is not the forgetting I want to talk about. I interviewed him about his relationship to Homi Bhabha and what happened, because he was offered a position, he worked at TIFR, went away, worked on his VA theory, and then this is what he says. But remember that he is 85 at that time when I'm interviewing him. This is the way he remembers his interaction with Bhabha. He says, when I left, I was considered a small potato. But it turned out that I went away and in 2 years' time, I became world famous. Bhabha said, I would like you to come back. I went to Washington to meet him. I said, I will come if you give me the next place that is the full professorship. So he said, I hope you don't insist on this one. I'll see what I can do. And he came back and said, I'm happy to say that the council has approved the appointment as associate professor. I was much younger at that time, so I wrote him a 3-line letter saying, this is not in accordance with what we had discussed. So at that point I tell him, I've seen that letter. And he goes on to say, and if this time you are changing your tune, that may not be a very wise thing for me to do. So I shall consider this correspondence closed. Nobody wrote to Bhabha like that. Nobody talked to Bhabha like that. But anyway, that was the end of that particular story. Those of you who've met George Sudarshan will know this is so typical. He would talk like this. But actually, the letter, which he had by then forgotten, was not quite as rude. It is slightly longer story because it is Marshak who first writes to Bhabha saying, will you consider, because he is done well, he's written this, he's acknowledged, so would you consider giving him full professorship? And Bhabha says, no one except Chandrasekharan and MGK Menon are professors, the rest are associate professors. He'll soon enough be a professor because others have also done work and they have worked in India. So that is in no way, and I quote, inferior in quality, originality, or extent to Sudarshan. Perhaps at that point, this is my comment, was unaware of Sudarshan's path-breaking work in BA theory. But the lack of recognition for this work was not just Bhabha's failing, as we know that it wasn't recognized, in other circles as well at that point. Now, Marshak, of course, doesn't write again on Sudarshan's behalf, but Sudarshan responded, and this is the letter I'm referring to, where he says, he acknowledges the magnitude of the task of building a first-class academic institution and says that I admire you greatly. It is, however, not clear that we achieved fully satisfactory communication. As matters stand, it appears that there is no possibility of my returning to the Institute at the present time. It is possible that both of us might wish to consider this question at a later time. However, since there seems to be substantial lack of agreement in our respective assessment of the situation, this may not be necessarily feasible, and you should not feel constrained to reconsider this question unless you specifically wish to do so. So this is not really the kind of letter he recalls writing. So what I'm saying is that, the post-colonial archive will have a lot of this kind of thing, contradictions if we really include oral history within it. You begin to see, how people remember and what is forgotten. Sorry. I want to turn now to, another example of the past in the present, because I think the post-colonial archivist will have to look at the past and how it plays itself out in the present. This is one of the showcases in an anthropological gallery called The Evolution of Man. All large museums have a gallery of this kind, and now they'll all have a DNA model right in the middle, and I can't show you all of that. But this is the Calcutta Museum again, and this is the genetic landscape of India. Notice these heads here that you see of various tribes. That's the Toda woman. This is a Naga tribal. Now these heads, and I've asked the museum while doing the archives that why are they put here? They said, oh, this is a visual typology of different population groups. I said, yes, but do you even know who this man is? They said, yes, that's the head of Nihu Angami. I said, who is Nihu Angami? Nihu Angami was very, very important to the Naga Hills Commission, where they had written in 1929 to the Simon Commission saying, we do not wish to be a part of the territory of India. He's highly respected. And you have now reduced him to just one head in the museum. Not only that, he is made by Margaret Millward, who was an artist who came to India several times, worked in Shantiniketan when Tagore was there, returned to India again, and made the heads of the tribals, 100 heads, which was commissioned by the Anthropological Survey of India. Now, true, they were commissioned by the Anthropological Survey, but they were made by an artist. And she was here moving into portraiture because she made friends with Nihu Angami. And yet, colonialism, this is a vestige of what is left, created ways in which we understand certain domains, understand certain subjects. So we understand this to be in the domain of anthropology. This is not art, this is anthropology. This is a visual typology for anthropology. It cannot be art, even if it's done by an artist. So this is something that as a post-colonial archivist, we have to watch out for. Because, you know, this can easily recount the racial types that most of us want to now get away from. But what else are you doing? You're using the genetic map, but you're using the same stereotypical images. And that's why, too, I feel that we need voices in the archives that raise questions. So I'll give the historian the last word, and this is Barun De, who taught in the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, and I'd interviewed him for the book that Venkat mentioned, but he did a very interesting thing. Indian Institute of Science in Calcutta was modeled on MIT's Sloan School of Management. So the emphasis was on qualitative analysis, but they also hired a historian to teach economic history. And this is what he had to say about his experiment with teaching management students.
I mean, I've had a lot of people telling me that they thought it was a good introduction to life as an Indian citizen. Basically, that's the way I thought history should be taught to a multidisciplinary course. Life as an Indian citizen. I liked it.
So life as an Indian citizen, the post-colonial archives would tell us about our relationship to the past. It also will tell us the way in which institutions that originated in the colonial period reinvented their identities. The post-colonial archive is necessarily a critical space which raises questions about the categories the archives uses and what such categories are driven by. Is an anthropological object a part of a visual typology, or is it an indication that the colonial discipline of anthropology still directs the labeling of such objects, and that if we took a broader view, the same object might be viewed differently as a portrait or rather as a hybrid object? For those living with identities conferred by the state, the national identity and the idea of modern education and development erases other forms of cultural memory, sometimes producing reinvented identities and at other times creating new interpretations of contemporary events. And finally, new methods of collection might actually enable people to articulate their own sense of the past and re-evaluate their relationship to history. With such a shift in emphasis, it becomes possible to see that we can create a post-colonial archive and have new interpretations. And with that, I think I'll my talk would come to an end. And maybe these are some of the pictures of, people asked talk to, right from a Nobel laureate to Imarti Bai. So you'd see that unless you populate it with voices which will say something different, it would be very, very difficult to have an archive that can call itself a critical post-colonial archive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Indira. We'll take questions from the audience. I'll start. Hey, go ahead.
In your series of photographs from the TIF or Math Department that had been cropped to emit Casey and Kosambi, who was actually producing this narrative that didn't have Casey or Kosambi in it? Who was actually doing this before?
Well, at that point, it can't be any single person's decision, but of course, immediately after Homi Bhabha, Professor M.G.K. Menon took over as director. The particular exhibition I'm referring to went to Royal Society, and it represented Bhabha in a certain way. And I feel it was at that point, I don't know who exactly took that decision, but at that point, you have a decision to, depict only Bhabha and only physics. So I don't think you see it after that. The present exhibition has brought it back. It was one of the first things when I was talking to the mathematicians who said that, will you make sure that Casey is back in the exhibition? Pardon?
This earlier exhibition?
The earlier exhibition date is, he died in 66. The exhibition was in 67, immediately after. So it is very adulatory of Bhabha and tries to show him. So, but it does have a certain way of cutting off Casey, cutting off. So there is quite a lot of, quite a lot to be said about the relationship between physics and mathematics at that point in the institute. So I've worked a lot with that in the book.
Indira, just wondering, in the last statement, the last snippet was from the historian at
Barun De.
Barun De.
Yeah.
He talks about the life of the Indian citizen. Now, if one looks and asks what was he trying to explore, and what was he trying to tell the students? Whose life was he trying to talk about? Was he talking about the large Dalit communities, or was he talking about middle class India, or the newly? What is this?
I think
life
when
of the Indian
he
citizen?
speaks about that, what is interesting is he teaches economic history, but teaches it from the point of when colonialism, when empire comes in, and what is the way in which how there's a drain of wealth. So he's not really looking at categories like Dalit, but he is looking at economic history and looking at, why is India today the way it is? It is not because people are lazy or they can't work. There has been a drain of massive amount of wealth. And this is the period. So when you go into industry, this is what you should know. So a lot of these students who went to his courses, they said, the interesting thing was that when we talked to our colleagues, our students, the students in Ahmedabad, whenever we'd meet, we realized that they didn't ever address the history of colonialism in India and what it had done to, why it was so difficult to build industry. Whereas we had the background. So we could actually understand that, okay, this is why, these are the problems. So it was interesting that he, shifted the focus. He didn't teach it like usual economic history, which is taught, industrial revolution. He actually brought it to India and started, teaching it from 1770s onwards, you know, what was the Mughal period, what was that decline, and what happened to trade. So I think, you know, that's what he was doing, not focusing so much on identity, I think.
Ma'am, when you spoke about the Saperas living under a cover, and when historians go and explore and find out more about them, and you know, you write about them, and aren't you putting an entire community at risk in terms of the government perspective? Because they are the snake charmers.
No, I'm trying to understand risk.
So risk as in, so it's like a false identity, right? They are saying that they're not snake charmers to come under the clause of reservation.
That's what they're telling me now. Actually, to go and change their, you know, to get that certificate, I don't know how many of them have gone and got official certificates saying they're Saharials. They want to claim that. But we all know in India, these kinds of identities are also not easy. I mean, in the same place, I'm not far from there, there is, you know that there is a tribe called the Meena, and there's a caste called the Meena. Now, what happens is that this guy who's talking to me, he says that, well, you know, in Rajasthan, we are a scheduled tribe, but I'm a Meena, I'm a caste here, so I just go to Rajasthan and I'm just Meena, so it's okay. I get the benefits of the scheduled tribe because I'm a Meena. So these identities, I think the point I'm making is that these identities are conferred by the state. And we all know that they're often abused. But even if they're not abused, these are not identities that people always go with. They're problems on the ground. Because, you know, these are categories that were created, and you'll find that they're not always matching what you go and meet on the ground. Like the Meenas, who very flexibly slip from one state to another. And same thing happens with the Nagas, that you have different tribes, but they have their identity, and they're not always in India. So, you know, the reason why you cannot do certain things is because there is that, it's not, identity is not fixed in that way. So I think that was more the point. I don't think I'm putting them in any kind of risk. I think they are expressing a desire for a different identity which might give them some benefits. And the reason they want those benefits is what they have. Their knowledge is not acknowledged. They could have easily earned by being resource people in that park. I mean, you could have done that if the government had any imagination. So.
In the process of capturing oral history, how much of truth is restored?
What is, I mean, what do you mean by truth?
Because you will have to take the interview with people and take facts from them. And I mean, do you think everyone speaks out?
No, I don't think I go to collect facts when I go to do oral history interviews. Not at all. I get my facts from various documents. When I go and record oral histories, I'm trying to get at meaning. I know what the facts of partition are. But when I interview somebody, I understand what their emotions, what their experience is. It's very subjective. So they are telling me what their experience is. What did this thing mean to them? Which is very different from facts. Right? So oral history therefore requires that you're not trying to fact check. I will never tell my father's aunt that, oh, this didn't happen on 18th August. It happened on the 17th. It's not the issue. The issue is what happened when, you know, when she heard the announcement. What did it mean for her? What was she trying to do? So that is really trying to find human reaction to an event rather than a fact. Yeah?
could you throw some light on the religious and science practices which was followed then? When Homi Bhabha died, there was this photo where a Parsi ceremony was arranged in DFR, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, could you throw some more light on that? Because as far as I'm concerned, even till today, science and religion in India go hand in hand in terms of whatever practices they practice at home or in the laboratory. So they're both different. So how do you view that incident happening inside TIFR and then?
Yeah, that's what, you know, when I was trying to understand it, here the interesting thing was that I would have expected it to happen in the home. But when they had it in this public space, there were very interesting things couple of things that people pointed out about that photograph. That, in fact, the first time I showed this to R.M. Lala, who actually started the Tata Archives. Mr. Lala was a Parsi, so the nuances of the religion. I said, you know, what shocked me about this photograph was it was not in a home, it was not in the Agiari, it was in a public space. So I haven't seen this kind of thing. Though I don't know what kind of prayers were said, maybe it didn't matter. He said, oh, well, this is interesting, isn't it? And then I said, so what is interesting? He said, look at that. Because TIFR has this glass curtain here, they found a way to have all the non-Parsis, non-families outside. I said, oh, I never thought of it that way. I thought it was quite convenient. He said, convenient also. But that is what he made me notice. I never noticed that about this photograph. People who are this side are an aunt and a cousin. I don't see his mother, J.R.D. Tata, all Parsis, right? But, you know, the earlier thing that I mentioned about his mother being very close to the scientists as well as to the staff, I think they didn't see it as if she asked for it. It was agreed to. And his friend, who was a member of the council at that point, who had seen him through this whole thing, Professor Choksi, again a Parsi gentleman who was professor of English and Latin at Wilson College, he actually had written speech, and he says, in what other place than this temple to science that he built should he be, you know, paid, should we pay respect to him? So I feel it's entirely appropriate. So it was interesting that, you know, that all this around a forgotten event. So I didn't blame the scientists for not remembering it. The photographs brought it back, but for them, it was the condolence meeting, and there are no photographs of that. Whereas this one, I not only found the photograph, someone who'd helped me in the archives, Mr. Islur, was among the audience somewhere here. So he actually even gave me the sequence. He said, oh, first they did this, then they did that. I mean, he's not Parsi, so he doesn't know what prayers were being said. So it's interesting that it was in a public space. But I think there's something interesting about the private relationship between private and public there. That, you know, if I look at early photographs, Bhaba's mother is very much there. People remember experiments, balloon flights where she's present. And she's, in fact, I think when we released the book on Bhaba, Vasudevachar, who was, he was a technical assistant, a very poor man who came from Kolar and joined Bhaba. He actually had come, he was sitting right there when we released the book. And he told me, he said, you know, we used to go for balloon flights early in the morning. And she would be the one who would say, Homi, have these men eaten? Have you made sure that they've had... So I think it was a much more personal thing, and that might have vestiges of that remained, and the Institute then said, yes, you can have it here. I don't think that's possible now. I mean, the other thing that was told to me but again, I have no archival records of it. The first registrar, who was N.D. Putran, he passed away, he died of cancer, but his desire was that some part of his ashes should be strewn in the lawns, because he was so fond of the institute, and the director had paid attention to it, a much later director, but someone who knew him. So I think people have very personal attachment sometimes to institutions. So that's what I can say.
I have a question. So when you talk about this post-colonial archive, I mean, I suppose as a general rule of thumb, one could say there's a whole lot of forgetting in every archive. There's some stuff that always gets left out. So I'm perhaps overwhelmed with that question, especially when it comes to the sciences, that when we look back at this time 50 years from now, what kind of blinders do we have? I mean, how do we look at this point and say that we've sort of done some meaningful representation of the times, in a way that, if you think of the colonial archive, we can always talk about people without history, and we can sort of just be aware of these gaps. But how do we? There's always going to be a limitation in the archive. There's always going to be some forgetting. There will be some selection. So where does it stop?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, because I don't really know that there's any archive where everything can be kept. This was an issue that came up when we were years ago discussing the IISC archives, where the then librarian, forgetting his name, Venkatesan, he had said, we had this conference, and he had said, how do you know something might be important and you've thrown it away? So it's hard to, take that decision for the future. You can only hope that you are sort of doing a representative, saving of things that are available. But I'm sure there'll be gaps. People are going to look at my oral histories and say, she didn't ask this. And I look at it, and then I say, Beth, why are you gone? I needed to ask you this. So, and I've done 15 hours of interviewing with him. And even so, I feel oral histories remain very incomplete. And because every day he'd have remembered something and told me. And then next day we'd begin again, revise. And then he'd say it a little differently. Sometimes some detail would get covered, sometimes it wasn't there. Now when I look at it, when I think about it, I say, I didn't ask that. So that's going to be there. I don't think it's going to be that perfect archive. That's not, doesn't exist anywhere. But I feel that it's more like whether you're doing it with a critical mind. I mean, when we talk about a post-colonial archive, it is really, are we being critical enough about the material we are putting in? Because I know that certain archives are very sort of careful, saying, we'll preserve this and not that. You also have the opposite. For example, we set up the archives and did a book for IMSC in Chennai, the Institute of Mathematical Sciences. And there the question came up that what is it? And this is an interesting forgetting, because they said, why is it that you have so many photographs of the first 21 years and you don't have much about when the institute changes after Alladi Ramakrishnan's time? Alladi Ramakrishnan is someone who's quite aware of his place in history. He's very aware of what he's doing. Everything is photographed, everything is documented. That is there in the archive. There's a period after him when, we were really trying to look for photographs that would represent that period. So, some periods are better represented than others. And I think it was interesting that the Institute felt that they had done much more work after his time, and that was not adequately documented, except, of course, the papers were there that they had published. But every occasion was not photographed. So it was not there.
Right. If we have no more questions, let's thank Indira again. There is tea outside, and we'll see you in a